So thank you very much again, colleagues, for joining this meeting. A very warm welcome to each one of you. I'm very delighted to open this important webinar on social capital and inclusivity in displacement contexts. So probably just to highlight that this webinar has been co-convened in partnership with Meraki Labs and the EUTF ABLI Garissa program, of which ABLI is an EUTF Area Based Livelihoods initiative program that is running in Garissa in its 5th year of implementation. I'll start off by introducing ReDSS and myself. Of course, my name is Patience Kiara. I'm the ReDSS director based in Nairobi, sitting at the Danish Refugee Council office, a regional office in Nairobi. ReDSS is a coalition of 14 NGOs that are working on displacement and durable solutions in the region. And we are not an implementing agency, but really ReDSS operates at that intersect between evidence and analysis and policy and programming. And the idea really behind ReDSS is to challenge our systems and our structures to do more and better to support durable solutions for affected communities. So currently, our geographic coverage is in East Africa, focusing on protracted displacement context. And we have country offices in Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Burundi. More recently, we are exploring contexts with more active crises, such as Sudan and the regional Sudan response. So we are establishing our work around early solutions thinking in this context, including Congo as well. But for now, predominantly, the countries where we are working on are really more focused on protracted displacement. So in terms of the team that we work with, I will have an opportunity to introduce at the end of the webinar. Again, also in the interest of time, but we do have teams sitting in all of these country contexts, whom you will introduce to you in terms of their contact as well for follow-up after this. So thank you so much again for sharing your expectations for the webinar. Quite a number of interesting things came out. We had 96 responses, and we did ask all the participants to share with us your expectations for today's session. And a lot of interesting things came out. So this is just to show you some of the things that did come out, including keywords such as social cohesion. Again, we will look at the differences between social cohesion and social capital. They're not one and the same thing, but quite interconnected. There's a question also of inclusivity and what we mean by inclusivity, what we mean by exclusion, and what we mean really by social capital. So we hope that in the next 2 hours that we are together, we can really delve into this terminology. One, in terms of better understanding what we are actually talking about, but also in terms of what that means for our work and for our context. So at this point, just to take another few minutes to set the scene for the webinar that we have today. And I'll start with our story. So we have Ahmed and we have Mohammed. Think about this. They are both registered refugees in Dadaab. They both live in the same community. They're living under the same governance structures, and they're facing the same challenges. But their outcomes could not be more different. And when you look at a scenario, we'll delve into this story of Ahmed and Mohammed a bit more in the course of the webinar. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that this is something that we see across the context, that you could have two people with very, very different outcomes, regardless of being within the same context, the same structures, the same aid being provided to them. So Ahmed, with strong community connections, able to access schooling, able to access vocational training, and eventually do quite well in terms of self-reliance in business. And then you have Mohammed, on the other hand, a minority clan, someone from a minority clan, very weak social networks, and really struggling to access support. And so he continues to live precariously in the same context and continues this life of vulnerability. So what explains this difference? And it's not aid alone, but social capital. It's the networks, it's the trust, it's the community structures that either open doors for some and close doors for others. And this is not only about Dadaab, it's not only about Somalia. We see this in Ethiopia. We also see this in Sudan. We also see this in South Sudan. We see this in Tanzania. So basically, wherever displaced communities live, those dynamics around social capital and kingship and ties and local leadership do come across very strongly in the type of work that we do. And oftentimes, unfortunately, this aspect of marginalization often remains invisible to us as aid actors. So colleagues, this reality should cause us to pause, and especially now when we can't afford to miss these dynamics. And what we've seen is that the 2025, post-2025 funding dynamics and funding cycles will not allow for business as usual approach, because we are seeing a lot of demand from donors for better efficiency, for more strategic engagements as we come under immense pressure to show results, and as we come under immense pressure to target better and to make use of the resources, the little resources that we have. And so we risk failing those that are most in need if we are unable to better understand this concept of social capital. So this is why we've invested in this work. ReDS has, over the last 1.5 years, taken time and invested in in-depth research, not only in Kenya, but also in Somalia, to better understand how social capital impacts access to protection, impacts services and livelihoods. And we've built an evidence base, which we hope to demonstrate today. And it has showed us that exclusion is not random. It's really patent, it's very predictable, and it's very preventable at the same time. So there we hope to start a conversation that helps aid actors and policymakers not only to recognize social capital, but also to look at how to apply a social capital lens, a social capital eye, and an inclusivity index, inclusivity eye, basically, to program design, but also to policy influencing. So next slide, in terms of what you can expect from the session today, so that I can stop talking and hopefully we can get into it. We'll start by unpacking the problem of exclusion in terms of what we actually mean, and taking a deeper delve at the story of Ahmed and Mohammed. And then next, we'll introduce the concept of social capital and inclusivity model. Again, terminologies, better understanding the concept, the application, and why it matters for program effectiveness and efficiency. Then we'll tell you about the tools and the guidance that we've developed, and how these tools and guidance can be useful for you in your own work. And then finally, we'll open up the floor and hope for a session of reflection and discussion. And we'd like to hear from you. What resonates in your context? And how can ReDS be of support, I think, moving forward? So thanks again for being part of this conversation. We look forward for honest discussions. We look forward to exchanges and experience sharing. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Andrew, for the next session of the webinar. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patience. And also thank you very much for colleagues for taking the time to join. My name is Andrew Maina, and I'll be one of the facilitators for this session. So I want to go into the meat of the webinar, and I want to invite Ruta and her colleagues from Meraki to take us through the next session. Ruta, please, the floor is yours.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ruta Nimkaya. I'm the director of Meraki Labs. We're a research company whose work is co-authored by people with lived experience of conflict and displacement. And we've been working on the social capital and inclusivity model together with ReDS for about a year or a year and a half now. So in this section of the presentation, sorry, next slide, please, we will be covering 5 points. We'll briefly outline the definitions that we're going to be using today. So what precisely we're talking about with regard to marginalization, social exclusion, and social capital. And then we'll explain why it's a challenge. Like, what does it mean for the people that we're aiming to support, and why? We'll then look at some of the dynamics around social exclusion. Why does it happen? What kind of underlying factors drive exclusion? What kinds of aspects of an individual's social, political, and economic life does exclusion affect? And then we get to the meat of this part of the presentation, which is that we will look at what we can do, what we as aid actors can actually change in our programming, in slight ways, in cost-effective ways, to be more aware of and to better leverage social capital. Following that, a brief conclusion and a reflection. All right, next slide, please. We'll be using 5 major definitions throughout today's presentation. The first is marginalized groups. Marginalized groups are groups that are on the border or at the edge. They have contact with 2 or more cultural groups, but are not fully accepted in any of them. Marginalized groups can reflect a wide range of different factors. So for instance, IDPs and refugees can both be marginalized because they come from one location and are belonging in another, or are located in another currently. Similarly, people from minority clans, people who are a part of minority clans can form a part of marginalized groups. Similarly, people who with specific characteristics, such as gender, such as age, can form marginalized groups. Marginalized groups can be excluded through social processes, so they can face social exclusion. Social exclusion is a systemic and relational process through which individuals and groups are persistently hindered from fully participating in social, economic, and political life. This, in turn, restricts their access to opportunities, services, and community support systems. Discussions of social exclusion do filter through humanitarian aid. We often talk about social exclusion of women and girls, for instance, also of social cohesion of, for instance, people with disabilities. What this presentation aims to do is step back and look more widely at how social exclusion affects all marginalized groups. Meaningful participation is another kind of term that will be referred to in this presentation, and that refers to participation by all relevant parties in the political process and the process of governing over a longer period of time. Sometimes this might be through a formal system. Other times it might be through community governance mechanisms. So it might be through engagement with community elders. It might be through engagement with local authorities. The 4th definition is self-reliance, which refers to the social and economic ability of an individual, household, and community to meet its essential needs in a sustainable manner and with dignity. Self-reliance generally refers to the ability to meet basic needs, the ability to have an ongoing income that lets you regularly meet needs in the future, and the ability to plan for the longer-term future. Lastly, social capital refers to connections that people have with others in, at, and across places and territories that they can use as resources. So basically, social capital is the networks that people have that allow them to identify and access practical resources. Now, all these definitions are inherently very conceptual and theoretical. In practice, what does this mean? Next slide, please. We're going to explain the concept of social cohesion through 2 stories. And we're going to give you a scenario. So Musa is a program manager for an NGO. He oversees a project aiming at improving self-reliance and resilience in Kenya and Somalia. He works very closely with communities in Dadaab. He sees individuals, he reviews documentation, and he reviews his program outcomes. When he reviews his program outcomes, he noticed that there are 2 general types of project participants. One can be exemplified by Ahmed. Ahmed is a registered refugee in Dadaab. His family had really strong community links from before he was born. When he was young, they heard about an aid program that supported school children. So his family enrolled Ahmed in primary school and received financial support. They also received information about how to register Ahmed in secondary school. Later on, Ahmed himself got information about how to register into a vocational training program. As you all know, secondary school graduation is a prerequisite as well for entering into a vocational training program. After the program, Ahmed got a small business grant. He started up a stall to repair mobile phones. His parents, his family, his community, others in his network referred customers to him, and he became successful. Today, Ahmed is a community leader, and he tells others about aid programs. Within his network, among the people he knows, he informs them about the aid programs that helped him and the ones that are available to help them. Musa observes that Ahmed has benefited from multiple successive iterations of livelihoods programs that helped him to achieve financial autonomy and enhance his self-reliance. It's also noticeable that completing one program was often a prerequisite to entering into another. Secondary school was a prerequisite to enter into vocational training. Vocational training is a prerequisite to get a business grant. Ahmed contrasts with Mohammed. Mohammed is also a registered refugee in Dadaab, but he's from a minority clan. His parents didn't have good relationships with the community elders when he was young, so they were unaware of how to access INGO support for primary school. So they did enroll Mohammed in primary school, but they withdrew him because they didn't have enough funds and they didn't know how to access aid funds. After he was withdrawn from school, Mohammed took on temporary labor. He tried to access further education, but only found out about courses after they'd been fully subscribed. Mohammed's savings decreased during the drought, but he didn't know how to ask for help from neighbors or community members. He only approached an INGO when his family's situation was critical, and then he only received food and water support, so basic needs. Mohammed lives precariously. He and his family have little self-reliance, little engagement with community elders, and no relationship to aid actors. Overall, Musa observed that Mohammed has been unable to achieve financial autonomy, but at the same time, he needs it the most. So Ahmed and Mohammed were in very similar positions. They were in the same community, they had the same governance structures, they had the same opportunities. But Ahmed achieved self-reliance. He became a community elder. He had a thriving business. Mohammed, in the same community, did not. Why? That's the key question that this presentation aims to answer. And it aims to look at the role of social capital in the different outcomes for Ahmed and Mohammed. Next slide, please. The research that we did, which is basically research into examining the difference between Ahmed and Mohammed and why they went in different directions, it draws on a wide range of evidence. There's evidence from the region that Somali IDPs that had stronger social networks and connections with the aid sector fared better during the 2011 drought than those who did not. Communities that were marginalized in 2011 actually learned from this and built stronger networks to withstand the 2022-23 drought. Similarly, in Ethiopia, South Sudanese refugees with greater connections with diaspora and kinship networks had more access to information, support for schooling, healthcare, new businesses. Again, a similar dynamic was found in Ethiopia, where Eritrean refugees with stronger social connections had greater access to resources than those who did not have social connections. It's interesting that this also applies on a macro level. An analysis was done by academics of aid that was provided by the World Bank to different countries, and it compared the impact of the aid on countries with high social capital and with strong legislative frameworks. aid was more impactful in countries with social capital than it was in countries with strong legislative frameworks. In short, social capital makes a difference on an individual level and on a macro level. Next slide, please. So again, this presentation aims to ask why these different outcomes happened. What dynamics allowed Ahmed to become self-reliant? What dynamics contributed to Mohammed's exclusion? The next question is how aid actors can support Mohammed in particular. Because if we are looking to support and build the resilience of the most vulnerable, to help to mitigate humanitarian need, hopefully before it starts, identifying Mohammed at an early stage and building his self-reliance and his community networks can help to achieve this goal. It can help us to have more impact. Next slide, please. The dynamics behind social exclusion can perhaps best be explained in terms of positive and negative cycles. Ahmed benefited from a positive cycle. At an early age, received education assistance. That assistance enhanced his skills. It gave him literacy skills, numeracy skills, and social skills. That increased his engagement, not only with his peers, but also with aid actors. So he got information about aid programs, both from those in the community who had already benefited and from the aid actors himself. This in turn allowed him to access still more programs, which allowed him to secure better jobs, which allowed him in turn to have community trust and to grow into an elder who in turn provided information to others. In short, Ahmed entered into a positive cycle really early on, and he was able to continue in the cycle because he knew people who gave him information about how to take the next step, and they gave it to him in a timely fashion, and because he had the skills that allowed him to access the next step. Mohammed, in turn, had limited community links, and this happened from a household level, from when he was a child. Because he had limited links to community elders, he and his parents lacked information. That, in turn, meant that they couldn't advocate for a place for themselves within aid programs, especially aid programs that build longer-term resilience. And that meant that Mohammed was stuck running around after day-to-day income with limited time, resources, and energy to invest in the long term. He then received aid, but aid that was only designed for basic assistance that didn't allow him to invest. In short, social capital generates a positive cycle. It generates a positive spiral. Lack of social capital means that you stay the same or negative. So those without social capital will always be driven, will always maintain the same level and be worse affected by shocks compared to those with social capital. Next slide, please. We've aimed to identify and to explain the factors behind these cycles through three aspects: marginalization, inclusivity, and social capital. Marginalization refers to the historic and contextual factors that may result in exclusion. These can be power imbalances, discrimination, and prejudice. For everybody in the audience, women can be a marginalized group. People with disabilities can be a marginalized group. Minority clans can be a marginalized group. Marginalization refers to the initial set of factors with which you start engaging in the process. In Mohammed's case, he comes from a minority clan with little influence, and he faces discrimination because he does not belong to the in-group that has access to resources. Social capital refers to the collective value derived from social networks. So basically, somebody who knows 100 people within their community, 20 people outside, and 10 people who have jobs at aid organizations has more social capital than somebody who knows 5 people within their community and nobody who works within an aid organization. Mohammed's parents had few social connections in Dadaab that they could rely on for support, and that included both information and money. So that's the pink and the blue aspects of inclusion. Those who are marginalized and who also do not have social capital are likely to experience worse outcomes than those who are marginalized and do have social capital. The pink and the yellow aspects. Okay, next slide, please. The third aspect of social exclusion dynamics that we wanted to identify is community social structures. As we all know, communities often have informal mechanisms of making decisions that includes elders, decision-making councils, individuals with influence. Sometimes these decision-making structures are relatively open to us. Other times, we can't see what happens within these structures. The dynamics of these structures can have impacts for exclusion. So, for example, in some social groups in Somalia, the community social structure and the traditional governance mechanism includes a donation from every household to pay for scholarships for the most vulnerable from that group. So a community social structure helped to alleviate social exclusion and helped to address marginalization. Community social structures can also reinforce marginalization. For instance, if they don't listen to requests from women, or if they don't listen to requests from other groups. So there's three factors that contribute with social exclusion. It's the cultural and historical context of the household. It is the networks that that household has, and it's the community governance structures in which that household operates that can drive social capital results. Next slide, please. So again, that's a lot of description of what social capital is. Now, part of the question for us is how can we work with it? What can we do to address social exclusion? Also, what can we do in the current context where we don't have much money and we don't have much resources? Next slide, please. So we, as ReDS and Meraki, have identified specific ways in which programming actors can leverage social capital. One of the first is better targeting. So targeting those who have lower levels of social capital in order to reduce the imbalance between them and people who have higher levels of social capital. We've developed two tools for this, the Inclusivity Index and the Social Capital Index. The second is supporting empowerment and agency. Quite a bit of research, especially in Somalia, demonstrates that it is possible for marginalized groups to negotiate with their governance structures to achieve better outcomes. But in order to do this, they need two things. The first is access to resources, and the second is negotiation skills. So we can support marginalized groups to access resources and to improve their negotiation skills so that they achieve better outcomes through their existing social systems. We can help to create buy-in by providing incentives for dominant groups to engage. That can involve everything from supporting local government actors who demonstrate a commitment, tangible commitment to inclusivity, to supporting community elders who make an active effort to reach out to the most vulnerable and excluded in their community. We can also support dialogue and accountability by building inclusive forums for negotiations. Through all of this, we'll better understand how we're doing and whether we're including social capital if we take a conscious approach to mapping actors and tracking progress. Next slide, please. So we've developed two tools that can help agencies that are interested in using a social capital lens. The first is about measuring inclusion in Somalia. The inclusivity of local governance structures is slightly complicated because what it takes to be inclusive is different in different communities. The Inclusivity Index focuses on working with communities to identify what factors they need to feel included. So working with marginalized groups to identify these factors and tracking how these factors change over time. So basically saying, what do marginalized communities need? Like, do they need access to a local governance system? Do they need to feel protected by security actors? Do they need housing, land, and property rights? So what are the 10 most important things that they need? And how do these indicators change over time? That, in turn, helps us measure whether we've supported marginalized communities to have access to resources and to have access to skills. We did this in Somalia. There is a report that identifies the 12 factors that were included. That's the diagram that you see on the right. And the research is also available for more discussion later on. Next slide, please. We've also developed a social capital score that aims to understand whether individuals and households have high social capital and whether they can be, and whether it's possible to target those with lower social capital. So the score includes specific metrics for bonding capital. So it includes specific metrics to understand whether or not people feel trust in their community, whether or not people would ask for help from their community, whether they can engage with community members in other places. So whether they have links in the diaspora, whether they have mobile phone technology that helps them stay in touch, etc. And to understand the types of social capital that they have with regard to aid. So do people engage with aid? How and why? On the basis of 12 markers, the social capital index provides a score, and that score can be used to assess the level of social capital that an individual or household has. One of the things that's notable from the research that we did with ABLI-G is that there was a list of shortlisted candidates for the program, and there was the selected candidates. There was a really strong social capital difference between the two groups, with those who were selected having much higher social capital than those who did not, particularly with regard to linking capital. In short, if you already had relationships with aid institutions, you were more likely to be included as a beneficiary. So the social capital score helps to identify those who are most vulnerable and helps to adjust targeting and outreach systems to reach these populations more effectively. Next slide, please. Basically, the big question, why should you guys who've come to this webinar care about social capital? The reason you should care is because our programs are more effective if we take social capital into account. Our programs deliver more impact if we take social capital into account. There's aspects of our programming which assume a high level of social capital. Programs that rely on self-referral, for instance, require that people know about the program and that they feel comfortable engaging with institutions. Similarly, vulnerability criteria are often communicated through elders rather than through agencies. We have relatively little time, energy, and effort, so we're more likely to engage with people that we already know. When there's security issues and when there's access issues, these problems exacerbate. So it's quite easy for us to implement solid programming that has impact, but also that targets those with the higher levels of social capital, meaning we contribute to a dynamic of exclusion without intending to. When we take this into account, when we take social capital into account, we see the effect on resilience. So for instance, Sudanese refugee networks in Jordan were supported by local NGOs. They built the bridging capital, they built their linking capital, they built their resources. Over time, external aid declined, but these networks actually became a source of aid and support. So they built not only their own resilience, but the resilience of other refugees as well. Similarly, refugee social capital has been leveraged to support improved health outcomes across Canada, the US, and Australia. In short, we have blind spots that we don't realize about our program. When we take a social capital lens, it's possible to address these. Next slide, please. The interesting part about this is that it's also possible to address these with very limited cost. So the overall conclusion, individuals with low levels of social capital and marginalized groups risk being excluded from both community support and aid. Exclusion generates a negative cycle, which exacerbates inequality within communities and leaves certain individuals with very low capacity to build their resilience. This happens because aid might be delivered to easier to reach groups rather than those most in need. That could be because of access constraints, it could be because we overestimate the degree of social capital in the community, etc. When that happens, and we need to fix exclusion retroactively, when there's groups that have already fallen into need because they're excluded, it costs us time and it costs us money. So after Mohammed had reached a crisis point, he needed food, he needed water, he needed all the basic humanitarian support. And he needed that not to build his resilience, but just to achieve basic needs. After that, he needed additional investment to achieve resilience. Whereas if an investment had been made in resilience in the beginning, he would not have needed the additional investment in helping him to meet the basic needs. So fixing exclusion costs time and money. Addressing exclusion from the start helps us to be more impactful, and it helps us to achieve value for money. When we address exclusion, we engage with the most vulnerable in the community, we improve the impact of our programming, and we reduce the risk of unintended negative consequences. Next slide, please. So some of the key messages, first of all, to humanitarian actors. Addressing exclusion from the beginning by measuring it as a part of your targeting criteria and as a part of your results matrices can help to reduce additional costs. We've produced social capital and inclusivity indices that are easy to roll out, that are designed for aid actors, that are designed for limited financial capacity, human capacity, time, and resources. These are simple tools that help to make sure that the most marginalized are reached, and it helps to ensure that exclusion isn't deepened. The inclusion approach that we propose can support humanitarian actors in economic recovery programs as well, so that economic recovery programs reach both Ahmed and Mohammed, so that Mohammed reaches a basic level of resilience and he does not need humanitarian assistance in the aftermath of a drought. Points about effectiveness and efficiency. Even short-term humanitarian action has long-term consequences. If we address exclusion from the beginning, that helps to make sure that groups become better off and that there's less exclusion and cohesion issues between different groups. The indices that we're talking about don't delay action. They actually just improve accuracy and support prioritization. They've also been designed with field teams in mind, so they're very light touch. They're lightweight, they're scalable, they can be easily integrated into existing assessments and feedback systems. They also improve accountability as they can be measured over the long term, and they can demonstrate the types of changes made by aid and the longer term impact that has been achieved. Next slide, please. Sorry for going long. Those key messages for development actors include using both the social capital and the inclusion index to better identify marginalized groups and to help them to negotiate for their rights at the local level. It can be really hard for development actors to reach the local level and to reach especially informal governance systems. Using these indices can help both to reach the systems and to track the actual outcomes for the worst off. The inclusion approach also fits into the development logic that looks at root causes. The indices that we're proposing also complement other tools, such as clan mapping and service mapping and political economy analysis. They help to identify marginalized groups, track the impact of programming over marginalized groups over time, and track perceptions of what rights are important. The social capital and inclusivity frameworks, they exist. They can be applied to different forms of marginalized groups. So they can be applied to minority clans. They can be applied to people with disabilities. They can be applied to women. They can be applied to different groups to better understand the challenges that are being faced. So they're adaptable tools to different development challenges. Next slide, please. For donors, these indices provide a framework for monitoring and reporting. They support accountability and transparency, and they help to improve value for money. So they help to assess the degree to which aid is producing impact for the most vulnerable. They help donors avoid costly programming failures because of poor targeting. They enhance accuracy, and they help to maximize the impact of every dollar spent. They also help to mitigate risks associated with aid generating challenges and conflicts between different groups and associated with unintended consequences. The approach is not about aid actors dealing directly with majority and minority clans. Instead, it's about supporting aid actors to equip marginalized groups with the skills, resources, and negotiation strategies to effectively participate in and lead their own negotiations. So it enables donors to track long-term impact and to respond to public and political pressure for more equitable aid distribution and transparency. Thank you very much. I went a bit longer than intended. My apologies. I hope you found that interesting, and I welcome any questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Ruta, for that insightful presentation. Just before we proceed the panel discussion, we're going to have a short Q&A session, and we do hope that you can be able to use the Q&A sheet in your Teams app. But we also encourage, for those of us who already reflected, you can go ahead and mute and ask your question. Please be precise and clear so that we take a good time to have all questions answered. So I see Amy Rogers, you've raised your hand. Go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. And thank you, Ruth and Patience, for the presentation. I think it's hugely insightful, the work that you've been doing, and it's super clear. My question is, and I'm sure you've thought about this, because the marginalization of certain groups is often by design, and the topic of minorities in the different contexts that we all work in very heavily politicized, how you would recommend we go about that specific element of the problem? Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, that's an interesting thing, because that's part of where the Inclusivity Index came from. There's many, and yeah, thanks for the question, Amy, because it's definitely something that you gave a lot of thought to. There are specific marginalized clans or minority clans in Somalia that, as you said, are sometimes excluded by design. They're also excluded not necessarily within transparent governance forums, but instead within the social structures that we don't see and that involve elite bargaining and negotiations. However, there were also clear examples in the past, especially in Somalia, of minority groups without the support of aid agencies negotiating for their own rights. So in one location, a marginalized clan accessed money and resources from diaspora communities in order to engage with other clans to support their own position. And over time, they grew so strong that they became effectively a majority clan in that area. So part of the reason why we're saying that aid actors can support access to resources and negotiation capacities is because minority groups have forms of leverage that are not visible to us. And if we kind of help them in supporting in negotiating and in accessing resources from outside, it's possible for them to negotiate for better solutions to themselves in a system that is unquestionably opaque. I hope that answers.
Thank
Yes,
you,
sure.
Ruta.
Thank you.
Anyone else with a question? Please feel free to put your hand up. Yes, go ahead, Rajev.
Hi, Ruta and Rights. This is a wonderful piece of work. You've done quite a lot of insights in this research findings. I was wondering if you had looked at a comparative insight of the displaced people and their traditional ways of building social capital from where they're displaced. Because in the displacement setting, people from different clan, different socioeconomic background, they actually displaced and they came to in different parts of the cities in Somalia. So there are two things. One is, did you also look at the timeline of the displaced people when you interacted with them, or it was just a standard approach, knowing their social capital and social exclusion within the humanitarian response area where NGOs are working only? Thank you.
I'm going to start this, and then I'm going to ask maybe Hakeem to give some insights on Somalia. So this analysis it draws on two different bits of research. The first was in Somali urban areas, where we looked at different IDP groups coming into the areas. And that was the focus was on inclusion. For social capital, we looked at Dadaab, so we looked at refugees. In the context of Dadaab, because we were looking at social capital and whether or not it affected people, whether people were selected for programs, we did look at length of stay. It was a part of the quantitative data collected. In Somalia, again, I'm asking Hakeem to correct me if I'm incorrect here and to give his thoughts on it. We didn't look at length of stay, in part because people often displaced into a community that already existed. So one individual's length of stay might have been short, but their capacity to engage with local governance structures was actually dependent on the entire displaced group's ability to engage. And that happened over time, if that makes sense. But Hakeem, do you want to maybe add to that and tell me if I'm wrong?
No, that's correct. That's correct. The context of Somalia, or just even in other places, is around who you know is a determining factor when people choose to go to places that they're displaced to. So after the chaos, after the disaster, choosing a place to go, and so the determining factor, in addition to everything else, is that if you knew someone in a place, either a clan member or a family member, there's high chances that you'd go to that place. Yeah.
And then inclusivity in the governance structure would depend not on you as an individual, but as in your community's presence in that place.
Exactly.
Great. Yeah.
Right, we have a couple more questions. Bakonyi, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I share with others that this presentation was very insightful and find it very helpful. Nonetheless, I have some questions and concerns, and I would only share one of my concerns here. So assuming we really manage to empower people, helping them to build their social capital capacity, their capacity to mobilize or build social capital or make use of it. Now, we know from context worldwide, not only in Somalia, but also in Somalia, that the moment you empower people or people got empowered and stand up to those in power, that there can be backlashes. Reactions of those can be very violent, and not only in Somalia, but also in Somalia. So I wonder if you also have a means to ensure that people who, assuming we are successful and build up power or social capital of people, how do we prevent a backlash or prevent violent reactions of those who have suddenly to share their capital or their power? And just to reiterate, that's not a Somali problem. It is also a Somali problem.
Yeah.
Ruta, we could have the ones who've raised their hands ask the questions, and you can go ahead and respond to all of them. So just to say, we only take the 3 people who've raised their hands at this point: Ali, Mohammed, and Hannah. And then Ruta, you can go ahead and respond to those questions, and then we'll move on to the next session, which will be the panel discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Ruta, for this great work. My question revolves around the definitions of the marginalized groups. You've cited the academic definitions of who is marginalized, but I'm wondering if you have considered the conceptual definition. I'm saying that because, for example, in the DAB, we may have one group that's marginalized in the DAB, but when it comes to other area, maybe in areas where they came from, they are dominant, and maybe they're predominant clans in Somalia, and maybe when they are in the DAB, they are marginalized. And the same applies even in Somalia. And that even ties to my next question, which is now about the social capital. How do people get or develop their social capital? One of them, it's not just clanism or kingship, but also friendship as well. You may find that there are some clans who are minority in Somalia, but who are also at the highest level of decision making in the country. So I'm just wondering if you have also considered those kind of definitions. You've talked about the recommendations, and you said better targeting. So I'm also wondering if you also maybe if you can also consider intentional targeting. For example, like you may target a whole area that you know that those are marginalized groups in order to raise their their conditions. So I'm just saying, like, for example, can you do intentional targeting, whether it is the whole group or maybe individual? So I think those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. We can go to Mohammed.
Thank you, Gideon. My question revolves around displacement. When we were doing this study, were you also considering the responsive capacities of the people living in the IDPs in Somalia, given the context of Somalia, the people are naturally pastoralists. Sometimes they derive their coping mechanisms through movement. So when someone moves to an IDP site, they may find life difficult, then they move to another IDP sites. So that pattern of movement will also affect their ability to integrate and also to develop that social relationship, to empower them, that whether they are considered for alternative income. For example, when we are talking about durable solution programming, we talk about long-term interventions. So sometimes it happens that people do not normally stay more than 1 year in a particular IDP. They move from one IDP size to another as a way of coping strategies to the different issues impacting their lives. So was that also a subject considered in your study or in your research? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. We'll have Hannah, and then that will be the last question that will be asked on the mic. Buhan, you can ask your question on the chat box, and we'll respond to it in the course of the sessions. Go ahead, Hannah.
Hi. Thank you. The presentation was really good, and I've learned a lot. My question was on the study. Is there an indicator of there's always the myth that women have better social capitals compared to men. So in the study, was there an indicator of whether men or women have more social capital compared to the other gender? Thank you. Or vice versa.
Great. Shall I respond? Thank you, everybody, both for the interest and for the many questions. I will go from the basic questions about how we consider definitions to the questions about implications and who was different. So one of the questions was whether we considered definitions of marginalization in Somalia, where for minority clans, minority status can change depending on geographically what region you're in, time-wise what region you're in. Yes, we did. So we basically took into account the fact that one clan might be a minority in one location and a majority in another. So when people displace to a city, they might be going from a majority where they were to a minority where they are. We also looked in that context at clans shifting power structures over time. So some clans developing more power over time as they get access to more resources, more money, more political power, etc. So the answer to that is just yes. There was another question about whether we considered the responsive capacities of IDPs living in Somalia and the effects of movement on social capital. So for the Somalia study looked specifically at inclusion, and it looked at inclusion in governance systems. So it looked at how marginalized groups and minority clans engage with clan elders and leaders from majority clans, and in turn as well with religious leaders and government structures. The relationship between clan elders and the negotiations between clan elders, to a large degree, it transcends movement. So, so a lot of the discussions that take place basically, like, it takes place within clan dynamics, but on, like, between clan elders, where both clans have been very mobile for a long time. So the Inclusivity Index, which really looks at governance systems, does indeed take into account of movement and the nomadic nature of different Somali groups. The Social Capital Index is more of an individual or household metric, so it doesn't need to do so as much. Then there was a question about whether there were indicators about women's level of social capital compared to men's. That was a super interesting one, because women's outcomes in terms of self-reliance were lower than men's in Dadaab, so in the ABLI-G project. But women's social capital levels were quite high. What was interesting, though, is where women had social capital and where they did not. So women trusted their communities more than men. They were more willing to ask for help compared to men, but they felt much, much less comfortable engaging with institutions compared to men. So they didn't have social capital, so what's called linking social capital. So that's the comfort with engaging with institutions, the experience engaging with institutions, or the prerequisites such as language in engaging with institutions. So it wasn't that women didn't have social capital, they did, but they were unable to transfer it to relationships with institutions. And what that means is that there's an additional resource to be used to support women to achieve more equitable outcomes. There was also a question about how people develop social capital and who precisely to target. So again, there's recommendations in the report about how to develop social capital. So for instance, in a vocational training group where there's people with high and low skill social capital, or high and low social capital, it's possible to create buddy systems, for instance, where they work together on projects, et cetera, which can help to build friendship dynamics and bonds. Similarly, there's ways of engaging around vocational training or around small businesses, like mentorship programs that also help less formal, more friendship-oriented social capital approaches. So we suggest piloting several of these approaches, identifying ones that are more effective and rolling them out on a wider scale. Intentional targeting. So with inclusivity and governance systems, I think by default, you're engaging with the groups themselves. So that is intentional targeting. Similarly, with self-reliance programming, it's possible to identify those with lower social capital and include them more in programming. So intentional social capital is possible. Lastly, the question about backlash. It's very true that there are dangers associated with empowerment. Part of the reason that we developed the Inclusivity Index as we did and the structures as we did was because when settlements are negotiated between different groups behind closed doors, they're more likely to not reflect the priorities of the aid industry and to reflect the priorities of the groups actually making the settlements. So we suggested helping to build negotiation power and helping to access resources so that direct discussions can take place between elite groups, government groups, minority groups, etc., and equitable solutions can be found that prevent the possibility of backlash. Basically, one of the things that we said in the Inclusivity Index is that while usually transparency is an advantage, it might not be in this case.
Thank you, Ruta. Over to you, Andrew, on the panel discussion.
Thank you very much for that session. And please, if you have further questions, please feel free to in the chat, and we will respond as we move along. So now we want to move to the next phase of this conversation and bring in voices that either experience this from their research or have lived experience in terms of resourcing and in terms of implementing projects that leverage social capital. With me on this panel is Mr. Ibrahim Hassan Mohammed. He is the Executive Director of an organization in Somalia called the Marginalized Community Advocacy Network, and he's part of this panel. I will leave the other elements of the speaker bio. We will share this presentation with you so that you can be more acquainted with the good work that he does in Somalia. Also on the panel is Ms. Mwajabu Khalid. She is the co-founder and head of programs at Dignity Kwanza, an organization working on asylum issues as well as refugee issues in Tanzania, and she brings on board some useful insights on leveraging social capital. On the panel as well is Mr. Binja Samuel. I don't want to use the second name for fear of butchering it, but he will let us know how to pronounce that. He's the founder and director of the Kalobei Initiative for Better Life. That is an refugee-led organization based in Kalobei in Kenya. And he'll also be sharing some insights around the resourcing question. And last but not least, we have Caitlin Sturridge. She's a senior research fellow at Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI, and also brings wealth of experience to this topic. So if I can maybe go to Caitlin as in the first round, and maybe ask, based on your research experience, do you think that the conclusions that we are making here on this model is supported by evidence that you've seen? And what other areas of further research or understanding is needed? Caitlin, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, good. I had a few internet issues this morning, so just let me know if I crackle out. Thanks so much for the presentations, the presentation, and for inviting me on this panel. I have to say it's a bit disconcerting staring at my face while I'm talking to you, so I'll try not to get distracted. Yeah, I mean, I guess your question is, do the conclusions that you've presented resonate with the research that we've done? So about a year ago, we wrapped up a 2-year piece of research looking at social cohesion. So a kind of a parallel focus to the social capital, slightly different entry points and kind of emphasis, but quite a lot of similar thinking and kind of research went into that project. I think from that, I mean, I've got lots of things to say about that, and I have a few kind of critical reflections, which I might hold back and just kind of focus on where it resonated and where it kind of worked in terms of our research. I think we definitely agree with the premise of the index and the indicators and the work that you've been doing. I think social capital is key in displacement. I think it often remains invisible to aid actors, which comes across in the presentation and in some of the documents as well that I've been reading by means of background. We're seeing across our research in Ethiopia, Somalia, Mozambique, Afghanistan, kind of globally, that networks are the most important lifeline for people who are displaced. We know that in many contexts, aid is either completely absent or it's ad hoc and sporadic and unreliable. And we know that communities are stepping in to support each other as a result of some of these networks. The way in which they support each other is also really important. It's very holistic. So in research that we're doing at the moment in Baidoa, but also in Ethiopia and in Iraq, we're seeing that the ways in which communities support themselves, it's not just a loan, although that does happen, small amounts of money being shared between people within a network. But there's also a lot of emotional support that is shared amongst these networks. People are sharing food, they're sharing information, which you alluded to really clearly in your presentation, information about aid opportunities, information about jobs. I think interestingly, there's a lot of childcare arrangements which occur between these networks, which are a really important mechanism for people to go out and pursue a livelihood. So communities of women are looking after each other's children. When people are unwell, the communities step in to support others. When there's a funeral or a kind of ceremony, then those networks really step in. So just to reiterate that this sense of social capital being really primary and really important in displacement, we definitely have found that in our research too. But maybe just one last point to say on that, and then I'll pass on to the next speaker. I think there's an interesting side of social networks and social capital and social cohesion that maybe didn't come through strongly, but I'm sure you found it in the research you were doing, that it's a really important kind of aid mechanism, I guess, but it does come with strings attached. So there is an emphasis on reciprocity. There's a sense of needing to repay the favor when someone else needs your help as well. And that can create at times a burden for people who are struggling with their own lives and their own livelihoods. And it can create a real sense of kind of stress and strain and pressure, particularly when it comes to repaying loans, for example, that were given during a time of emergency. So not to say that that outweighs the benefits of the social networks, but there are kind of catches to that. There are strings attached that can make it that can make those social networks become problematic when they're not sustainable. I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, thank you very much, Caitlin. Just before we do off on that point. So essentially, what we are saying here is that social capital in and of itself is not a silver bullet, but it is a useful tool to sort of promote that localized network of support, right?
Yeah, definitely. It is an important tool, and like we've kind of said, it is an invisible tool, which I think it's really important that we have these kinds of presentations so that aid actors are more aware of them. In the research that we've done, and maybe I'll kind of hold on to that because it's a different kind of answer to a different kind of question. There are some question marks around how aid actors interact with social networks, with social capital. There has been an increase in funding for there was prior to the funding cuts, an increase in funding for work in social cohesion and social networks. And we had some question marks about the ways in which aid actors were engaging kind of on that front. Whether that's the case anymore, I don't know. I think with the funding cuts, there is a real risk that this kind of work and that this focus on social capital is lost, perhaps, and maybe becomes even more invisible, as there is a sense that we need to refocus aid on kind of life-saving emergency relief. The focus on the social capital can become lost. However, if we take the argument that the social capital is the lifeline in humanitarian context, then really that re-emphasizes the fact that we need to be focusing on social capital, on reinforcing social capital as much as we can, because in the absence of aid, it really is the major lifeline for people.
No, thanks. Those are useful points. And maybe just to bring in Ibrahim Hassan to this conversation, and particularly maybe audience will be interested to hear, based on your experience as the executive director of the Marginalized Community Advocacy Network, what do you think that the resourcing of marginalized or excluded groups enables them, to better advocate? And if so, how so? If not, why not? Ibrahim, if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you, and very much, and for providing this opportunity, and taking part from the global webinar experience in terms of exclusion and also minority and marginalized community, especially the issue in Somalia. I wanted to give a picture on how and why MCAN is just to be on board because of the longer term of exclusion. And we see as a humanitarian, we see only an exclusion by the time the civil war and also the chaos started in Somalia, but not from that end. The exclusion and also marginalization is a longer term history, and my father and also my grandfather also experienced the same. There is an historical marginalization based on that. Basically, and the minority and the marginalized group in Somalia, the picture that I wanted to give from the spectators and also the guests, that there are a reasonable blockage in terms of geographical situation in Somalia, mostly and the marginalized and settled into the riverine and communities, and the riverine communities mostly and 87 to 90% of them are illiterate in terms of understanding, in terms of the language, and that has been background and caused by the historical exclusion that are being made by those groups, and the regime that are been existing in Somalia and refuse to build in their locations to school, and refuse to get the social services that are being immense in the country, then those are the back engaging in terms of that essence. When it comes to the recent, when it happens to the conflict and inclusionists, there were the first victims that are hit from the consequences of displacement, the consequences of exclusion, the consequences in regard to that immensity. And it was like a booting in a crime in Somalia back to 2010, 2019, to mention in a forum like this, and that there is an existing minorities. But due to the advocacy, due to the deliberately and messaging in terms of bringing out the voice of those groups on the table, is one of those advocacy and also victimized and communities are MCAN in terms of putting their voice, speaking loudly, greatly, and big achievement is being reached. One thing that I would also wanted to share in terms of the general widely, it has been long since I was just grown up. Then I used also to company meeting and also forums outside and inside of the country, just putting the advocacy and every researcher that done an inclusiveness in terms of the program. The problem is identified by the minority and marginalized community to consequently refer the same scenario that is been existing. So there is not a concrete and census that are being done, and it's in terms of the number of IDPs in Somalia and the number of those consequences that are having in terms of this thing are from those groups. One scenario that I wanted to share, and from the prospective presenters, and mostly the two takeaways that and you might have linking to the experience, is that access to resources for a minority, and would it been there for that and access to resources as an affirmative action, or and also at negotiation skills. That also the takeaways that comes from my mind in terms of that thing. Really, the 2 points is takeaway, and the 2 points that has been taken is serial matter that are been existing for the experience that we have in terms of marginalization, in terms of that thing. Mostly it has been mentioned, but we need to ask ourselves, and we need to ask the donors, the international communities, the INGOs, UN NGOs, and also ourselves. So what we are just saying, and whatever document and presentation is and researchers that are being carried, would it be reflecting back to the field? Would it be being practiced in terms of the field level? Are minorities being unable to change? It's really a major thing that has needed to carry out in terms of raising the minority and marginalized groups, especially in Somalia, in a sequence way, but through collaboration, through the engagement and consultation, much more such a way that it could really give them a concrete picture on where to move and where to go. Sometimes, and it is very hard to get the consultation from the minority and marginalized communities prospectively, and refusing that the information they give is more prominently promotive than the other information that are being carried out. So in terms of our experience, and yes, we have been working from 17 years since now, for the advocating and also leveraging with minority and marginalized communities. There is a long way that is remaining, but in the advocacy and speaking loudly in terms of inclusion matters, we did really a concrete and achievement, which is part of that, and the minority today has a representative in the HCT, which it couldn't have been before. The minorities are being represented in some of national level clusters, which was not been there before, but that terminus and enough would not be reached. There is still a high demand in terms of the exclusion of access to resource, partially, not only humanitarian, but in terms of development and resilience within the country. And I want to give in terms of the climate situation in Somalia, mostly it implies an impact to those people either in riverine, either in coastal line. Those are also most factors. Those people are familiar in terms of those agencies. That's also what we needed to combine and connect it into our humanitarian response. And also our donors must also understand that what is existing matters is only for papers, but not in terms of actualization happening into the field level. That's also how I would wanted to add on my point then, and for more preparation on some of the collaboration that we have done, which could even bring changes and also determine is by the time we include to minorities in surface level and also programming, then the other backfield minorities that are being marginalized, that are being left behind, which we normally determine in our research and also outcome of research and recommendations are being achieved. But are we reaching that one? Are we seriously taking that roadmap, reaching to this one to actualize the actual and the practical inclusion in Somalia and also elsewhere? Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Ibrahim. And before maybe I move on to Samuel, maybe if you can just reflect briefly on the secondment that your organization has been involved in with other particularly international NGOs in Somalia, in sort of transferring those resources, transferring the skills, so that MCAN can be able to achieve all the points that you're raising around advocacy and ensuring that the marginalized communities have a voice at the table. Maybe just a brief reflection on that, on the secondment aspect.
Thank you very much, and Mas Andrew. It's really the secondment that are being provided by MCAN has really strengthened it and the program delivery capacity of us as an organization, because it was embarked for our staff and building their capacities much more, and also enhance it and the case management and accountability system in our organization as a minority support, then support of knowledge transfer, monitoring, building a longer term capacity for our staff is also been achieved. And I wanted to share one truthful and success history that I wanted to share by reaching to that and secondment program. There was a young minority lady called Fordesa, who was being studied in Kenya as a Dadaab refugee camp, was part of the people who are being returned back to Somalia and for the voluntary repatriation. She was staying in one of the federal member states in Somalia, especially in Jubaland. It was really, and by the time she was in Dadaab, according to the information history, she was assisting UNHCR as an interpreter. But by the time she joined in Somalia, she has been applied number of vacancies, but we voluntarily and accepted as an MCAN and volunteer member staff that are supporting in our program. Because we were running lack of project and also programs that are automatically running and provide payment for the staff. Then we achieve one of the secondment staff. Then for those as she was being a member of volunteer MCAN staff was successfully nominated through the secondment program opportunities. She gained placement with DRC in Kismayo, especially protection unit. She was directly supported hundreds of vulnerable minority beneficiaries, whereby not only herself, but also facilitated the program that she was being benefited by hundreds of minority members, facilitating access of protection. And this experience not only allowed for those to contribute her scale, but also demonstrated how resource excluded groups can break the barriers that are really a blockage in terms of the exclusion of staffage, exclusion of services. For those that became the bridge between the community of minority marginalized communities and also service providers, because she was been already in placement, helping building trust between them, that minority voices are also represented in humanitarian programming. in her journey shows that as a marginalized and minority individual, for her, she resourced and being given space. They do not just improve their own lives, but also amplify the voices of the marginalized and minority communities. That's also one example, practical example that I wanted to share by the entire colleagues and also spectators that are been listening and watching to what we have been explaining. And the inclusion always matters. It was being taken historical barrier that are in place, and there is no even a confidence because of the minorities being presented in terms of the international organizations and also other UN organizations. By the time they get that inclusion, then there are a lot of barriers. Then even the number that have been suffered were about 60 to 70% for the beneficiaries in the success of the project were minorities. And only one minority member that are being included into the secondment resulted to that curriculum. That's also what I wanted to share in terms of that experience. There might be a lot of similar experience from the beneficiaries. It also applies then, and that's also why we wanted the inclusion always matters and why the inclusion always is more important in terms of this scenario. Thank you very much, and my colleagues and Andrew.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for that. And maybe just to bring in Samuel on that point, and maybe you can give resourcing RLOs from the Kenya perspective, and how that improves their ability to negotiate for their own rights. Samuel, hear me, please. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate for being here. Yes, my name is Samuel Binja Chimanuka, because Chimanuka was hard for you to say. Originally from DRC, I've been in Kenya for the past 9 years now, and I'm a proud refugee lead and advocate. To echo from what Ibrahim have said, I know Ibrahim brought a lot of points on board, but to me, I will speak in terms of why it matters when locals lead the advocacy by themselves. And here I want to first bring the first case scenario of the work that independent diplomat is doing with various RLOs in Kenya. They are working with 3 RLOs, and as we speak now, those 3 RLOs have developed advocacy strategies, and we hope them to unveil them very soon. And this is because independent diplomat realized the best way to go is to support RLOs to do what is meaningful for them. But far beyond of that, advocacy is when you are able to influence, and majority of time you influence when you are well equipped. For example, you can't just go to in a discussion where we're talking about refugee policies, for example, access to documentation, while you don't have evidence, you don't have, you can't substantiate your statement and so on and so forth. And one of the key stuff is that sometimes refugee-led organization advocacy is more on assumption and not more on evidence. And this is because lack of resources. We are not able really to have resources that enables us to do more research, like local-led research, to be able to understand what are the pressing issues. But what we use is what are the people telling us in an assumption kind of ways. But apart from that, I believe that if refugee leaders were equipped, were resourced very well fast, they will be able to tell positively their stories. And when I talk about telling their stories, I mean telling stories that have higher potential to shift the power, shift the policies, because only if the government sees the interest, that's when the government will be interested to shift the policies. Secondly, once refugees are are resourced, they will build very strong structures, very strong network within the country, within the region, within the globe, And this is because there are some resources enabling them to strengthen, because already we have networks, but do we have resources to strengthen those networks so that they are able to go over there and speak and represent the need of refugees? And one of the key aspects we find, sometimes we have a network, but they don't have a devolved function. Funds that are those who are in the camp, they are not aware of those kind of network. But all of this is because of resources. I will also look at once a refugee-led organization are empowered, are resourced, they will not be seen as just recipients of this aid and also mobilizers. You know, majority of time we are just used. Come, you have to go and speak. You have to go and do what? You have to go and attend. You know. But once we have resources, we are even able to cut for our own expenses to go and advocate, amplify these voices. We are not just passive kind of beneficiaries, but we develop that sense of being contributors. I will give you a tangible example. As I wound up with this question, is that now in December there is what we call high level, preparation of GRF and so on and so forth, So the question is, who is attending that conference? Majority of people will be either former refugees, or majority, like less people will be from this global south. Why? First, because it requires a lot of resources for a refugee from Kenya to go to Geneva. Second is because many people who are doing amazing work at the community level, they don't have resources to enable them to be known at the national level. That tells you many people that we meet in the bigger conferences over there, they are not the right people to be in those rooms sometimes, but I don't say that always, sometimes, because a refugee is not a specialist in all the sectors. But you find that because one has resources, because one has been part of this global network, he will be there to speak about environment, he will be there to speak about finances, he will be there to speak about, integration, he will be there to speak about law. That can't work. You must be either specialist in environment or specialist in a given area, so that you give other people space to do all of this. But this inequity comes because of lack of resources. I believe once our laws are well resourced, then we are able to track and push the right advocacy at from the bottom to the government and the high official level. Thank you.
Very much, Samuel, for that. I think that is there's a lot to reflect there in terms of resourcing of communities that are sidelined in policy processes, and maybe just to invite the last speaker on the panel, that is Ms. Majabu, to also reflect on some of the programmatic interventions that they did in Tanzania around pairing refugees and in also trying to their welcome, Majabu.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be in this panel as we try to see issues around social capital, social cohesion, and the social network that refugees have, and how it helps them navigate and building their resilience in the refugee, in the asylum country. So directly, I will direct myself on the program that we conducted, as you mentioned, business fairing, where we conducted, where the initiative was called Working Together, what we call business fairing between Tanzania and the refugee. And the thing was to show or showcasing that refugee, or changing the narrative, or showing the narrative that refugee are just like any other person. We share similar problem, but needs, but also we have potential, same potential, and if given opportunity, we're able to build our lives and things like that. So The initiative was pairing the, as I said, a refugee and a Tanzanian, and we focused on the urban refugees here. And this was after we conducted a need assessment, and one of the issues and big challenges around accessing capital for refugees, but also business licenses. And whenever you have a capital, it's hard to have a business license. And since majority were undocumented, but also business, employment opportunity, access to healthcare and education. Sometimes it was hard even for urban refugees to involve their children in the public school. So they use the social network to enroll their children in the public school because they cannot afford again the private school. So with this initiative, it was also to enhance and appreciate the coexisting relationship between the refugees and hosts, because the pairing was not, it was at liberty of the refugee to pick who is the partner they want there. And the amount was about 2 million Tanzanian shillings, which each pair received. And yeah, I would say it was really successful implementation, because not just the capital that they gave, but also they went through a business training to understand and to understand the business, and because it was like a startup capital, that it was showing that you have an existing business and where you're putting with money to grow your business. So all these refugees brought their business partners that they were working, and they went through a competition where they submitted a business plan, and we were able to select 6 pairs, and they were able to get this opportunity. And it was very successful, and because there was also mentoring after the award. They received the award. There was mentoring where we worked with business, successful Tanzanian business, who were mentoring the refugees business here to help them to grow their business, the market, and the sales. Yeah, so I'll say this was really successful and showing that how the social the social capital can also enhance, showing, changing the refugee narrative, that you will get also the opportunity. They got the opportunity to rule the refugees because of what they have been working with them together. But also, it was also a full of awareness raising about the misconception about refugees and the negative perception about refugees, just showing that there are people with potential skills. And yes, yeah, I hope this is okay about this. Yeah, sorry for the last.
All right. Thank you so much, Mwajabu. And yeah, just for the benefit of everyone, because then the audio wasn't quite great. Mwajabu was talking about an intervention they call business pairing, where they pair a refugee and a Tanzanian national, take them through a livelihood business course, and ask them to together jointly develop a business plan or a proposal that then would attract funding. And I think they tested this out and had a cohort of about 20 pairs of a refugee and a Tanzanian national, and I think out 8 got some funding, about 2 million Tanzanian shillings, to start a business. I think that's one example of how to create that bonding or rather bridging social capital, where we see interventions really targeting displaced population separately from hospital, and we often see displaced population as those ones that are somewhat marginalized and are unable to sort of make those linkages with the host. I think this is also another good example of how resourcing works, but also how incentivization works. Because obviously, Tanzanians generally people who have, come from a space where they have, a bit more privilege, a bit more rights than others, are unlikely to yield that, space willfully to marginalized communities to, to enter that space. But then, using this resource and basically using a resource that benefits both communities, essentially, also provides an incentive for dominant groups to essentially participate, because they also have something of value to engage. And I hope I haven't, distorted that point, because then I think that might also be a very good example of how to leverage on social capital. So maybe just one last question for all of you, maybe one last final reflection, less than a minute each, because I think I have gone above my time. What are some of your key takeaways from this, and one key advice that you'd give the panelists? So maybe we can start with you, Caitlin, as we go back around the panel. Over to you.
Sure, thanks, Andrew. So yeah, I guess I started off by saying that we definitely agree with the premise of the importance of social capital, social cohesion when it comes to displacement. I guess where our research maybe can come across as a bit more provocative and maybe even controversial with some aid actors is that we do have some quite significant question marks around I guess, the extent to which aid actors are best placed to strengthen, improve, influence social relations. We know that social relations are extremely complex, they're extremely shifting over time, they're delicate, they're fragile. And from the research that we did around social cohesion, I guess we arrived at a conclusion that actually maybe it's better for aid actors to step back from trying to orchestrate social relations specifically. That's not to say that social cohesion and capital isn't important for aid actors, because in many cases, we know that the way in which aid is delivered can significantly undermine social relations. For example, when the allocations of aid are not communicated clearly or they're not transparently explained to communities, there can be feelings of grievance which create problems within communities that otherwise have gotten along relatively well. So in a way, I guess, if you take the argument that actually maybe aid actors shouldn't seek to make social cohesion the primary objective of their programming, rather they should integrate it across their programming writ large to ensure that their programming does no harm, does not undermine and unintended consequences social cohesion. That raises questions around, I guess, programming, but also the utility of kind of indicators to measure social cohesion. If you're taking that step back, what are you going to be measuring? How is that going to balance out? And I guess another question I had was, who do these kinds of indicators, and this is me trying to be a bit provocative at the end, I'm not kind of necessarily kind of fully behind these points, but in some ways kind of who benefits from these indicators as well. We know it's what donors are expecting, we know it's helpful to aid actors, but they're often quite meaningless to the people on the ground who are kind of going about their daily business, going about their social relations, and these indicators can often be quite far removed from them. So question there as well, I think. And I think maybe just to wrap up with one last final provocative point is, I also wondered from our research the extent to which aid programming can really influence. So there's a question of should aid actors try to influence social cohesion and social capital. There are unintended consequences. There are question marks around whose role that really is. There's also a question mark around can they really influence social capital and social cohesion. I've already said that they're very complicated and complex, but we know that aid is very small and often absent in community settings. So it's really a drop in the ocean when you think about national policy, when you think about encampment policies that are separating people from each other, when you think about media narratives that create hostility between different groups, when you think about cultural kind of perceptions of different groups. Those are really the kind of factors that have the biggest influence on social capital, on social cohesion. And there is a big question mark, I think, around the extent to which aid actors and aid programming can really kind of push against those much bigger pieces in that social cohesion puzzle. I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, thank you, Caitlin. I think that's also sobering to also reflect on how much we can actually achieve and also be realistic in terms of the work that we do. Maybe over to you, Ibrahim.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. In 1 minute, quick reflection, last point.
Yeah, thank you very much. First, I appreciate and from the colleagues that are being given this chance. Second, and we have learned, because experience teaches. The inclusion and matters only when we put it down. We have seen the success from 5 secondments that are being presented by an organization is impacted from the organization in large and recruiting over 30,000 households in 2 areas, Jubaland, Gedo, and also Baidoa. Then a landmine and achievement of having GFFO implementation, then an SHF eligible for our organization. That brings the small size secondment that are being provided with MCAN in terms of that leverage. So why not? And if we get from a higher number, is a number of the inclusion also matters. And I wanted to say a message, and that always matters to the enlarged team. And the cost of exclusion, the cost that we determine and get from excluding to a certain group, to a certain people, we will have enough, and it's better than the cost we normally receive to include people and also personnel in our services. That is also why it should be much more important to the community in large. And that's also why it is much more important as a humanitarian organization or our humanitarian development sectors to focus on those vulnerable that need to be scaled up to sustain and also provide the kind of support that they are having. So, largely known that aid is a very prominent, it's a very limited, but let us focus on who need most, and the geographical locations that need most, not having the power dynamics that mostly negotiate and also provide guidelines to where aid is being taken. Thank you very much. That's what I wanted to last on the last minute that I was being given. And I would say that let the ReDSS and also other core teams that are being present here follow the footstep of the changes that are already been seen, the practical outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Over to you, Samuel, for your final thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much. To echo to what my colleagues have said, I will, in just a minute, first, I want to tell the people here that change does not require intention always. Sometimes it requires intention. So I want all of us to be more intentional when we are taking decisions. That's one. Second, I want to inform the people here that we can't speak about refugee policies if refugees are starving. With the differentiated assistance in Kenya, people in Kakuma are starving. So we are not developing policies for people who are going to die. And we need to tell implementing partners that it is right to implement policies that respond to the need of the people. We can't talk about social capital if people are starving. We can't. Lastly, I want to make an appeal to all of us that if we are so intentional, this is a time to shift our power to the actual leaders, to actual entities who are making impact within their communities. Let's not be bullied by people who use a lot of social medias to be famous. if you want to make change, we don't go with famous people. We go with impact-oriented people. And those people are in the grassroots. Those people are within the camps. Those people are within the communities. Let's work with them and ensure that we don't just work with them for the short-term consultancy kind of stuff, but we enable them with flexible and multi-year funding that enables them to own and lead the entire change, the change value. So with that, it's my call and humble request to invite everyone to have an attention to what is happening in Kakuma and Hope in Dadaab, to ensure that the differentiated assistance is responding to the really need of the people, but not to the need of implementing partners and UN agencies. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Samuel, for also contextualizing, this discussion in what is happening in Kakuma and Kalobeye. Quite useful. Maybe the last, your last thoughts, Mojabu, if you're still there, before we conclude.
Okay, I hope this time you'll hear me clearly. So for me,
yes,
just,
slightly better. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's scaling up these kind of initiatives where enhancing or promoting coexistence of the community and refugees, which I would say they are more of strong tools for evidence-based advocacy, but also awareness raising, public awareness raising tools for more inclusive refugee policy. Taking an example of more that now that we have more restrictive policies where refugees are not really included when it comes to livelihood and things like that. So through these kind of initiatives that shows refugees potential will be very, very helpful in policy change. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for my panel. I think just from what I have drawn from this conversation, I think number one is that I think we're all in agreement that social capital and supporting useful connections and social relations is important, but we also need to be very careful on how much we can achieve in terms of that, how much aid. What is our role in pushing that? Sometimes we might be entering into situations where there are already useful social relations, and basically our programming is disrupting that. So the elements around measuring and understanding the context first is quite key. Also elements around understanding how the system, how everything is linked to each other, how rhetoric within the media, how policies are framed and implemented also have an impact on social capital and our ability to to support that, and also a clear understanding of doing no harm. Sometimes I think echoing what Caitlin has said, sometimes it may be better not to do anything than to do something that will actually cause more harm than good. And of course, these reflections, can be seen across the model that we're advocating for in terms of really engaging with the community and understanding what is useful for them and relevant for them in terms of their inclusion, and essentially engaging with the structures through resourcing as well as incentivizing dominant groups to to engage. I think the other element I've seen or rather heard from this panel is around resourcing and the possibilities around that. Secondment in terms of supporting human resources, hiring of groups that are disadvantaged or marginalized is quite key. Partnerships, I think that the point on secondment has come out very clearly from Ibrahim. Partnerships and really supporting RLOs has come out very clearly. Be able to, for them to be decision makers directly and be able to be part of that conversation rather than going through intermediaries. The other, practical way, particularly in the livelihoods space, is what has been mentioned by Mojabu around this business pairing and looking at targeting both communities that have low social capital with those ones that have high, and sort of pairing them and bringing them together to what is a common problem could be one way to look at it. So thank you very much for this, and I would want to now hand over to Patience for the final elements of this webinar. Over to you, Patience.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And again, very much to the panelists. But just to say a very big thank you to the panel. That was very insightful and very useful reflections coming out there. And I think what has become very clear for us is that social relations, social capital that inform inclusion and exclusion really come down to power and power dynamics. And power dynamics are complex, very, very complex. And especially when they are deeply rooted in, societal norms, governance structures, and so forth. But there are ways. I think it was very sobering to hear that there are ways that we can use to provide communities really with the tools that they need to negotiate within their own spaces, but at the same time recognizing that there will be unintended consequences, but also a number of trade-offs. So what we are hoping to do as ReDS is to take this conversation a step further. And we are going to have more targeted, very contextualized discussions happening in Kenya and in Somalia through what we are calling ReDS Inclusion Programming Labs. This terminology has become very famous lately. So we have a lab on inclusion, which will happen in November in both Kenya and Somalia. So please be on the lookout for that. We will use the same mailing list to invite you for those conversations happening in November. What we are also developing, which again, please be on the lookout for, is a programming guide on meaningful participation. So this is basically a program tool, a how-to guide based on the evidence that we have generated that can really help practitioners in terms of conceptualizing the question on social capital, how to include it as a lens across programs, and as Caitlin said, not necessarily to have it as the objective of a program, but really how to streamline it within programs so that then it's a lens against which we are doing our work. Then we will also be developing a training module on social capital and inclusion. And this will be online, it will be available online, a number of very simple modules that you can take online by yourself, which can also be done in-house. So it's going to be two-pronged, kind of a training module that can be done physically or online, self-paced type of a learning module. So there are a number of work streams that will go on as a next step from this, and we will be sharing all of that with everyone in the near future. So with that, thank you so much once again. We will share the slides, and I know at the end now we were going to share with you the contacts for which you can reach out as on. Meraki Labs contacts will be there. Our contacts will be there in both Somalia and Kenya. So please do feel free to reach out and to also view more of the resources on our ReDS website, www.regionaldss.org. So I think with that, I'll bring this to a close. Thank you so much once again. Looking forward to subsequent conversations.